While we need to adapt and change public services to meet a changing New Zealand population, we want those public services to be grounded in enduring values of service to our community. And I want to talk about both of those things today. For Labour, strong public services are integral to our social democratic vision. They are the collective response to the needs of our communities. They redistribute wealth, they offer opportunity, hope, safety and security. And from a Labour point of view, we will stand proudly on our record. In the last government, we had to rebuild public services after National systematically undermined them through the 1990s. I don't need to tell people in this room, around 20,000 jobs were lost, services and funding were cut across the board in areas like health, social development and justice. National's approach in the 1990s led to a loss of institutional memory and capability, frontline staff undertaking heavy administrative load, does this sound familiar, and leading to poorer services and increasing use of consultants and contractors. When Labour came into office, we had to address this. We increased staff numbers, especially in areas like police, the health sector, child, youth and family. But we also did it because as a government, we were doing things. We were implementing Working for Families, KiwiSaver, interest-free student loans. National's spreading a lot of myths about what happened under Labour, and I do want to just briefly address that. While staffing did grow, I'm sure you'll be well aware it wasn't out of proportion to the work that needed to be done, and it wasn't out of proportion to the rest of the workforce. Growth in the wider state sector was actually slower than employment growth in the private sector under the Labour government. The core public sector grew as a percentage of the labour force from about 1.9% to 2.3%, still significantly less than the 4% it was in 1990. Government expenditure did grow, but according to the OECD, as a percentage of GDP in 1999 in New Zealand, government expenditure was 41%, 20th in the world, and in 2008 it was 41.7%, 17th in the world. That is not out of proportion growth. Treasury figures also indicate, and this is one that you'll certainly know, that public sector pay grew at about the same rate as private sector pay during Labour's time in government. The only exceptions to this were for teachers, doctors and nurses whose pay fell far behind under National. Now this is not to say that everything was perfect under Labour, and I know that everyone in the room who worked through the last 8-9 years of a Labour government will have issues. But what we prioritised was investment in public services, and we attempted to try and rebuild some trust and confidence in the public sector by keeping our election promises. Because every day when Tony Ryle stands up in Parliament and talks about the number of job losses, I reflect back on what John Key said to you in 2008. He said that services would not be cut. He actually said National's tax cuts won't mean cuts in public services. The reality of what National has done, their approach to the public sector, has been marked by two main things, and you know about this: cuts to services and staffing. National's returned to their 1990s approach of cutbacks in the public sector, but they're doing it a bit more cleverly. It's not the big bang. It's not Ruth Richardson. It's incremental. It's death by 1,000 cuts. And the job of people like me and people like you is to make sure that the public is aware that these cuts are going on just because it's not been done through a big bang. Nationals justified their cuts by saying that they're cutting back on backroom staff and moving services to the front line. They've done this without any definition of the front line. I asked every government agency who came in front of me at a select committee what was their definition of frontline services and backroom services. Most of them don't have one. But National's approach is one of indiscriminate cuts. They are about cutting funding, not creating quality public services. It is, as across much of National's program, the accountant's approach, for seeing the cost of everything and the value of nothing. The other element of National's policy that I want to highlight are the steps towards privatisation in both services and advice. And actually I don't really need to do this because Tony Ryle did it in his speech to you yesterday. It's no secret that the National Party's agenda is to privatise core aspects of the state sector and to sell state assets. They made a promise not to do it in the first term, and they're grudgingly trying to stick to that. But they've actually already begun with ACC, and Bill English has got his eye on Kiwibank. There's almost no commitment to public broadcasting in terms of TVNZ and Radio New Zealand, and the list could go on. But the other aspect I want to mention is the privatisation of advice. Now, this is continuing at pace. It began with the appointment of hand-picked purchase advisors. It's continued with a string of advisory groups picked to deliver the outcome that the government wants rather than what the evidence might show in areas such as tax, housing, welfare, savings and regulation and more. And now it's continuing with a review of policy advice headed by the former ACT candidate and Treasury Secretary Graham Scott. In the wake of the announcement of this particular review, Bill English noted that nowadays it was easy to get policy advice from the internet. This, as I called it in Parliament, government by Google approach seems to be the favoured way for the National Party. Actually, the entire setting up of that particular working group, or that inquiry that Graham Scott's doing, relied on a statement that $800 million worth of expenditure was happening on policy advice, and there was a little footnote in the document, and the footnote said that this figure of $800 million had been arrived at by searching the budget documents for the words policies and policies, policy and policies. That's as good and as rigorous as the National Party's maths gets. Apart from anything else, why wasn't the word advice used? We're going to start from the perspective that we need to organise and deliver our public services on the basis of what communities need and how they can be best provided. Now, I'm not going to pretend that under Labor there will suddenly be a huge amount of more resources. Efficiency is important, but what I want to stress is our starting point, unlike National, is not to automatically cut funding. Our starting point is how do we establish the best quality public services. We do need to focus on developing clear outcomes across the public sector. And this will require agencies to work together in their development, share resources, and operate with different reporting and accountability arrangements. Last night I met with the New Zealand Refugee Network. They're desperately working with the Department of Labour on a single integrated plan for refugees that takes in issues around mental health, housing, resettlement, education, income support. We need to be able to work with a group like that across agency boundaries to deliver the best quality services. If as a country we're serious about sustainable development, then we have to look at policy development in the broadest sense and encourage far more integration. There's a good deal of efficiency to be gained through integration, and I'm not an opponent of the government's moves in the area of procurement. I think it's very sensible to have more cross-government procurement. I'd just like to make sure New Zealand companies could actually have a go at getting some of that procurement. We need to support the development of innovative approaches to developing and delivering public services. To do this, we have to address the elephant in the room of risk aversion. Risk aversion is driven by many different things in the public sector. Sometimes people have looked at politicians and said that they are the drivers of risk aversion. And I'll have to admit that politicians do play a role in that. So do departmental chief executives, and in fact the review of the Centre at the beginning of the last decade indicated that chief executive risk aversion was one of the major barriers to innovation. Innovation doesn't mean handing over public services to the private sector. It means trying different models of engagement with business and with community. A couple of very brief examples. I visited the Bay of Plenty earlier this year to look at COBOP. That is a network of central and local and regional government managers that have come together to develop 5 key social and 5 key economic goals for their whole region. They have a plan to deliver on those goals, and all the agencies are committed to them. We can take it to a more micro level. Down the road here at the Downtown Community Ministry, working under a contract from the Ministry of Social Development, DCM has developed an integrated care model that provides banking, budgeting, counselling and advocacy services all under one roof. We need to look at innovative ideas and see how they can be used across the board. But we can't just expect innovation to happen. It's very, very hard to innovate when you're worried about whether you'll have a job tomorrow. It's very, very hard to innovate if there's no leadership from the State Services Commission. And can I just say as an aside, the State Services Commission's role is now more important than ever. Treasury is reasserting itself like it has not done for decades. And if we are to have a balanced development of the public sector, Treasury, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and the State Services Commission, the so-called central agencies, need to be in balance. Responsiveness and engagement. We live in an area of increasing customisation of services where people are becoming used to access information instantly. We're also in an era where people expect to be able to participate in the design and delivery of the services that they receive. One size fits all means very little to Generation Y. Most government agencies are making good strides in the area of interaction with the public, but we need to do more. The challenge is to change the idea of delivering to delivering with. As Colin James has put it, perhaps it needs to be a case of less state services and more public services. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, Labour's proud of our record of rebuilding the public sector in the first decade of this century. We inherited a demoralised and decimated public service, and we worked hard to turn that around, and in turn, we worked you hard. We did not get everything right, but we despair at the approach of the current government. It's not about investing in our future and working to the long term, but rather where they can find short-term cuts. We welcome efficiency, but not at the cost of quality services for all New Zealanders. We need to do more to value public servants, to listen to you, to listen to our communities, to encourage innovation and efficiency and support professionalism. We need to do these things to develop public services for the 21st century. As Phil Goff said at our Open Labour event, the role of government in the 21st century is to have the courage and vision and willingness to change and adapt and try new things that are grounded in enduring values. That is Labour's vision for public services. Thank you. It sounds boring, but the first thing I would do would be to look at that legislation because it's out of date and it's actually working against all of those things I just talked about. So that it sounds like a dull response, but that's the first thing. The second thing, I'm going to take the liberty of making a second one because that is too boring. The second one would actually be to create the environment in which public servants like yourselves and the community and government work together on creating those new models that I talked about. We have to give the public a sense of ownership of public services. And the truth is, at the moment, a large number of people don't have that ownership. In fact, many people in this room don't have that ownership, and we need to ensure that both the people who work in the public service and the people who receive those services are part of it. So that would be my second priority. The first step to that is actually valuing public servants. One of the things I said in my maiden speech to Parliament was that I thought the first step that the National Party could take, if they really wanted to value public servants, was to stop calling them useless bureaucrats. Yeah. But also we actually have to set up the environment where we accept that the way people approach their careers has changed. So we do have to enable people to be able to come in and out of the public sector more easily. We need to engage more closely with institutions, with universities and places where people can go backwards and forwards to, and actually create the option that it's a career. We'll have some specialists, of course, but there will also be more general people who need to know that they can move freely around the public sector. Let's treat public servants with some respect and then create a career that people want to be part of. The reason why I didn't say those exact words were because we are still finishing our policy making process, but the fact is that I made that the first thing I talked about today, and that's clearly where personally I'd like to go. I think it's vitally important that we do. The model that the State Sector Act's based on, which was a private sector model of management, is now not being used by most of the private sector. Very few large companies actually use that absolute power model anymore. They actually have completely changed the way they do management, but our framework hasn't caught up with that. So the answer to your question is, look, I mean, our policy will come out soon, but I can guarantee you that it will talk about a review of these acts, and the PSA will be a key stakeholder in making sure we get it right.